a sermon on chapters 1 and 2 of Ecclesiastes. And some of you gave me some feedback. And I said, well, let's see what chapter 3 has to say. You know what? It's actually the third part of a trilogy. In chapters 1 and 2, I talked about how Solomon was facing a dilemma, and the answer is found in chapter 3. If I knew back then what I just said, I would have teased you and said, please come when I present chapter 3. The answer is found in chapter 3 about the dilemma that Solomon faced. In chapters 1 and 2, Solomon uses the term under the sun to notate that everything that he is talking about in chapters 1 and 2 is apart from God. So another way to understand what Solomon meant by under the sun is to exclude any eternal, heavenly, divine perspective on things happening in the world. Let me step back just a bit. When you present the third part of a trilogy, you provide a brief recap of what happened in the previous 2 episodes. That's what I'm doing right now. Okay, so under the sun means excluding God from anything that happens in your life. Now, for us, that might be difficult to understand, but stay with me because that's what Solomon faced. How could you possibly live apart from God? Solomon states that under the sun is useless, meaningless, an exercise in futility. In chapter 1, Solomon says, all the things that I've shared with you so far is vanity. In fact, in chapter 2, Solomon said he disdains life, he hated it, because for years he's trying to live a life that is fulfilling, living a life under the sun. He cannot do it. So, what did Solomon do to try and live a full life under the sun? First of all, he describes a number of natural, predictable occurrences like the daily 24-hour cycle, the water that comes down in the form of rain and goes to the heaven but goes to the sea, and it never fills up the sea, and it, because he has no control over some of these natural occurrences, it vexes his life. Okay? In chapter 1, verse 16 and 17, I have communed with my heart, saying, look, I have attained greatness, and I have gained more wisdom than all who lived before me in Jerusalem. My heart understood great wisdom and knowledge, and I set my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. When he summarizes these things, he says, I perceive that this is also grasping in the wind. Solomon basically states that if you think very deeply about life and think about all the heartbreaking things that are going on in the world, you will have no answers that lead to despair, no satisfaction, nor fulfillment. Now, I don't know what kind of heartbreaking events Solomon faced, but I think about heartbreaking events. I think about homelessness. I think about lack of human rights. I think about gender inequality. I think about human trafficking. I think about sex trafficking. I think about racial discrimination. I think about parents losing their children and children losing their parents. I think about the plight of refugees, which some of you may know is really close to my heart. I think about gun violence. All these events, they occur every day, lead to grief and despair under the sun. If all these events happen without God in the picture, there's just grief and despair. But later on in chapter 3, we will see how these exact same events can be experienced very differently under a totally different perspective. Solomon experienced all these things when he was seeking wisdom. He's trying to fulfill his life through pleasure, through wisdom and knowledge. Then he says, wait a minute. I don't get it. I spent years pursuing wisdom. I spent years gaining knowledge. What else can I do to try to fulfill my life? And so, since wisdom and knowledge didn't fulfill his life, he says, I'm going to try pleasure. I'm going to try enjoyment. So, Solomon uses wisdom to pursue paths of pleasure and enjoyment to find greater pleasure in life. He pursues pleasure to such an extent that he said, so I pursued pleasure without denying myself. And I have pursued pleasure to a level greater than anyone has ever done. Solomon uses his God-given wisdom to please himself. Think about that. God gave Solomon such wisdom, and he says, you know what? I'm going to give this wisdom that God gives me, and I'm just going to channel it. I'm going to pursue pleasure. Now, although the Bible does not go into detail how Solomon pursued pleasure, we can assume that it involved the best of food, the best of drink, beautiful women, the theater, entertainment, all pleasures of the flesh, including stacking your portfolio so that you can be the richest man on earth. Think about that. God uses God's wisdom that he asked so he could judge the people, God's people correctly. He uses that wisdom, that knowledge, to please himself. He sat down after he did all these things for years, and he said, it is utterly meaningless. There's nothing to be gained. There was nothing long-lasting from my pursuits of pleasure. You know, there's a period in my life for several years where I sort of can identify with Solomon about pursuing pleasure. Now, I was never in a position to finance my pursuit of pleasure to a high degree, because I had a very low degree of financial support. And my form of pleasure was sports. And more individual sports rather than group sports. Some of you may know where I'm coming from. I swam by myself, I biked by myself, I ran by myself, and eventually all those individual sports that I pursued, I combined into triathlons, and I was moderately successful. I always managed to score in the top third of my age group. But after 4 years of continuous training, I gave other activities higher priorities in my life. But when I look back at those 4 years, it was exciting. I got acquainted with lots of competitors. But in the end, it was just temporary. There was nothing long-lasting about those sporting events. Going back to Solomon, he says, you know, I'm not going to close the doors on finding fulfillment in the life. What I'm going to try to do is establish my legacy for building things. And he built things. He used his wisdom, he used his knowledge to build himself houses and gardens and fruit orchards. And to supply the fruit orchards and gardens with water, he built irrigation systems. And in the end, he said that apart from God, his pursuits in building things and establishing his legacy was totally meaningless. As a self-proclaimed woodworker, I have some success in building things. Now, I haven't built houses and I haven't built orchards, but I want to share with you some of the things that I've done that I would say were very successful. I love to build furniture. Okay, so this is something that I've built that I not only built furniture for customers, and then later on I started building things for myself. Okay, so here's a very functional panel-matched cabinet wardrobe. This went into a house that didn't have any closets, so this functions as a wardrobe for one of the things that I built. And I like to build organizers because my life is always in disarray. So I built little organizers for myself, and I built some quilt racks. This is far from what Solomon built. And I also like to carve things. These are I've carved horses, given them away to kids. I've carved fish and things. Oh, man, I can't believe I had black hair at one time. But anyway, I have some successes in life because I wanted to identify what Solomon did in building homes and orchards and gardens and building irrigation systems. That's probably among the first things that he really enjoyed, because he wanted to build himself a legacy. Yeah. I'm glad that I had this very productive run of commissioned furniture. It taught me some really valuable lessons. It taught me how to be flexible in designing things. It taught me how to deal with customers. It taught me how to be more patient with customers. Those are some of the long-lasting things that I take away from that phase in my life. I still build some furniture every once in a while, but it's not as high a priority as it was. So, Solomon, after trying various endeavors to find fulfillment in life, we come to chapter 3. Oh, and not finding it, we come to chapter 3. Chapter 3 provides a full solution to the dilemma: what do I do? Where do I go when wisdom fails to provide meaning in life? Where do I go when all the pleasure that I can pursue will not satisfaction? It does not satisfy my life's request for fulfillment. Where do I go on work or vacation, or all my human efforts won't supply any meaning in my life? Where do I go? The answer, 2 words: God's providence. Well, what does that mean? What does God's providence mean? It means foresight. It means God's foresight, that God's care and guidance in plan on how he governs the world. His plan for you. His plan for me. God's providence may very well be a topic discussed among different people, among different religious groups, or his followers, or perhaps an in-depth discussion among friends in a Sabbath school session where we allow for differences, where we allow for disagreements, But Solomon sees God's providence as the solution to all the world's problems. Let me say that again. I don't want to be redundant, but Solomon sees God's providence as the solution, not a quick fix, a solution to all the world's problems. God did give him that wisdom to say that. Let's see what he says, and I'm going to have to read it again. Darren, you did a great job of doing this for me, but let's read it. Let's read it together, okay? Just silent, you just follow along. To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. To everything. That's all inclusive. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant, a time to pluck what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. By the way, this word, a time to kill, is not the same word that's in the 6th commandment. Thou shalt not kill. It's a different word. A time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep, a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. Kathy and I were in Ireland last year. The people on this one island had no soil. And in order to set up a garden of some kind, they had to take the stones and cast them aside so that they could bring in some of the organic life from the oceans to build gardens. And then they took these stones and they built borders around their gardens. And I thought, what a wonderful way to try to get a grasp on what it means to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. Let's go on. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to gain, a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to sow. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. This is really a poem. And I determined its meaning is not entirely clear. But perhaps that's the true contribution of a poem. Understanding and finding meaning in this poem is an existential exercise. It's an existential experience. However, when we analyze the structure of this poem, it talks about opposites. Look at each one of these. And you can go back and look at the previous verses. Everything is an opposite. And in it lies its beauty. From one perspective, the opposites cancel each other's meaning, so there's nothing gained, there's nothing lost. However, according to verse 11, he has made everything beautiful in its time, which means that each opposite has a time that God blesses. Each opposite has a time that God blesses. It strengthens the fact that we are not masters of our own destiny. But these opposites are controlled by God. They take place under heaven, which is the widest perspective of accepting God's sovereign rule over everything. So Solomon uses the word under heaven to describe everything that happens in your life, Cynthia. It happens, everything in your line, Ada. Solomon uses that terms to describe God's providence in everything that happens. The opposite is everything that happens in a random-like, unfortunate, sometimes fortunate, fortune. Everything happens under the sun excludes God. Everything that happens under heaven is all-inclusive under God's plan of providence. You know, we may have a little control, but the vast majority of life is under God's control. What about events that are disturbing or painful? Under God's control? Let's continue here. I mean, who chooses a time to mourn? Who chooses for a parent to lose a child or a spouse or a marital breakup or being betrayed by a friend or a family member? Job loss. You know, these kinds of heartbreaking events produce weariness. People who live under the sun. But those exact same experiences under heaven, because it's part of God's providence, leads to comfort and confidence and hope, because we know God is in control. There's another aspect of the events of God's providence in His plan for our lives, and these take place at an appointed time. My friend Steve and I, every once in a while, we get together at Panera's. And in about an hour, we solve all of the political problems that come out of the White House. We only allocate about an hour, right, Steve? Now that event that takes place, where Steve and I, doesn't happen at some random time. It's scheduled. We know the place, we know the location, we know the time. That same concept of an appointed time is set by God in the events listed in verses 1 through 8. His providence determines when events take place in our lives. Our response to these type of events indicate whether we trust God, that He has a meaningful, purposeful plan for us, or that we are victims of just misfortune. It's one or the other. We talked about this in Sabbath school this morning. It's either one where you experience life knowing that God has a providential plan for you, or you choose to live without God, and everything that happens to you, whether good or bad, is just randoms at random. It's important which one you choose. Another aspect of God's providence is found in verse 11, and that says that God, has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from the beginning to end. Solomon says that God has put an innate sense of eternity in every human being. He's put a sense of Himself in every human being. Think about that. Sean, God puts a sense of eternity in your heart. You know? That eternity, that sense of eternity can only be filled by God because He put that there. If you deny that sense of eternity, you live under the sun. Solomon states that when God puts that innate sense of Himself in every human being, it provides order. It does not provide confusion. It provides order in life. Well, you say, does that sense of order exist in the life of a person who doesn't believe in God? It's a very good question. We posed that question this morning. Putting in eternity in hearts creates a longing and meaning that transcends daily life. A type of restless yearning that only God can fill. And yes, that restless yearning can ultimately lead to a relationship with God. Eternity is also the opposite of transitory. If you think about every one of these opposites, dimensions, descriptions that he referenced, is transitory. You know, if we look at time to embrace and a time to keep from embracing, a time to gain, a time to lose, a time to keep away and time to throw away. If you take those opposites and merge them together, what do you have? Nothing. You absolutely have nothing. But if you look at each one of those opposites and say, God bless this time, there's a blessing involved. It goes for the positive sides of that continuum. It goes for the negative sides of the continuum. When Solomon chose wisdom so that he could rule God's people effectively, which means he wanted to be fair and just and prayed for a discerning heart to judge right from wrong. The injustices during Solomon's time was sufficient for him to address the issue. And in verses 16 through 22, he presents a challenge to those who live their lives under the sun. The challenge that he posed to those living under the sun: explain the injustices in the world. Explain why these bad things happen. Explain why these good things happened. But he, in verses 16 through 22, addresses the injustices. A person who lives under the sun believes in a random order of life without meaning and has no answers to the injustices because there's no reference what determines good or bad. Only those who live under heaven, who believe in a creator God, can you have good or evil. Only with a creator God who has a moral order and a plan can you have hope in a world filled with injustices. A person who has a relationship with a transcendent creator, who has a moral order and plan, has hope and can face the injustices of the world, because in verse 17, Solomon states, God will judge, which means he has a solution to all the injustices in life. His solution? The final judgment. A person living under the sun has no solution because he doesn't believe in God. He doesn't believe there will be a final judgment. So those who do not believe in God's providence, who do not believe in the transcendent God, have no hope for the injustices of the world. Solomon brings it down to a very, very pragmatic statement. He says, they're just like beasts. No final justices, judgment. There isn't any different than being a beast. We come to a closing here, under heaven versus under the sun. A very timely way to deal with life's events that are not under our control. How do you react to them? Have you ever dealt with problem by saying to yourself, I wish that didn't happen in my time? Why do bad things happen to me? I said that when I lost several good friends due to untimely accidents. I even said that when my 3 nephews passed away, or an older brother, an older sister. Why do these things have to happen to me? Perhaps you've asked yourself, when a son or daughter turns his heart against God, or when a marriage implodes, I just wish that didn't happen. We ask, why did this happen to me? And the answer, we as Christians who believe in a transcendent, providential God, is that we can face these problems because we have trust that these events, as painful as they may be, comes to us from God's hand because He loves us. Fast forward a few hundred years in closing. Paul writes about the sufferings that Christians are experiencing and will continue to experience till Jesus comes again. He says the sufferings will be nothing compared to the glory God's followers will receive when Jesus comes again. So he encourages us, he encourages his followers to continue to hope in him so that they could have all the freedom from sin and receive the glory that rightfully belongs to God's children. That's you. That's me. And Paul adds by saying to be patient, wait the second coming. We have the Holy Spirit to help us, to guide us, to encourage us to stay true and strong. Cynthia mentioned that sort of as to encapsulate a part of our discussion in Sabbath school this morning. Then Paul says that everything God does is for the good of those who love God. Those who are called according to His plan. Not our plan, not your plan, not your spouse's plan, according to His plan. God is calling you to trust in Him as a transcendent God, as a providential God who has a plan that all the events in your life will happen according to His plan, His appointed time. And all He asks is, believe me. That's Romans 8:28. Everything that God does is for the good of those who love God, those who are called according to His plan. He's calling you.